The hall looked like something from another world. Crystal lights hung from the high ceiling, glowing softly and reflecting off polished floors. Round tables covered with white cloth filled the space, each one decorated with flowers and shining glasses. The guests wore expensive clothes and spoke loudly, their laughter mixing with the sound of music playing quietly in the background. It was the kind of place where money spoke before people did. Among all this luxury, the waitress moved quietly from table to table. She wore a simple uniform that blended into the background. Her steps were careful, her posture straight, and her expression calm. She had learned long ago how to move without being noticed. In places like this, waitresses were not meant to stand out. They were meant to serve, smile politely, and disappear. She carried a tray of drinks, her hands steady from years of practice. As she passed the tables, she heard pieces of conversations. People talked about business deals, vacations, and expensive hobbies. Some spoke about art and music, using big words and confident voices. They sounded sure of themselves, like people who believed the world belonged to them. The waitress listened without reacting. She had heard it all before. Working in rich spaces taught her how different her world was from theirs. For her, life was about long shifts, tired feet, and counting tips at the end of the night. There was no room for dreaming too loudly. At the far end of the hall stood a grand piano. It was black and shiny, placed under a soft spotlight. It looked untouched, almost like a decoration rather than an instrument. Guests walked past it, some stopping to admire it for a moment, but no one sat down to play. It was there to show class, not to be used. Every time the waitress passed near the piano, her eyes lingered on it for just a second longer than necessary. She never stopped walking, never slowed down enough for anyone to notice. But inside her chest, something stirred. The piano reminded her of another time, another life she rarely allowed herself to remember. She had grown up in a small home where space was tight and money was always short. There was an old piano in a community center near her house. The keys were worn and some notes were slightly off, but to her, it had been perfect. She used to visit it whenever she could, often staying late just to play when no one was around. Music had been her escape, her comfort, and her quiet joy. Life, however, had moved fast. Responsibilities came early, and dreams were pushed aside without much choice. Playing the piano became something she did only in her mind, a memory she carried silently while moving forward. Back in the hall, the event continued. Plates were cleared, glasses refilled, and laughter grew louder as the night went on. A few guests had already had too much to drink. Their voices carried across the room, full of confidence and pride. At one table near the center, a group of guests spoke loudly about talent and success. They talked about concerts they had attended and famous performers they had met. Their words were polished, but there was a sharp edge underneath, a need to show off. The waitress approached the table to refill water glasses. She kept her eyes down, focused on her task. As she poured, one of the guests glanced at her, then at the piano across the room. A small smile formed on his face, the kind that came with an idea meant to entertain. He made a comment about how everyone claimed to love music these days. Another guest laughed and added something about how talent was rare and expensive. Their voices carried, drawing attention from nearby tables. The waitress finished pouring and stepped back, ready to leave. But before she could move away, someone joked loudly that maybe the waitress could play the piano for them. Laughter followed, light and careless, as if the idea itself was funny. She froze for a moment, her hands still holding the tray. The words were not cruel on the surface, but the tone made their meaning clear. It was not an invitation. It was a joke meant to remind her of her place. Her face remained calm, but inside, her heart beat faster. She felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in her chest. Around her, a few guests turned to look, curious to see how she would react. To them, this was just another moment of entertainment. She took a slow breath and nodded politely, as she always did. She did not answer. She simply stepped back and continued with her work. The laughter faded as the guests returned to their conversations, satisfied with their joke. As she walked away, her thoughts were loud. part of her wished she could disappear. Another part felt something else entirely, something stronger and harder to ignore. The piano across the room seemed closer now, almost calling to her. She reminded herself why she was there. She was there to work, to earn money, to get through another shift. This was not the place for old dreams or risky choices. She pushed the feeling down and focused on the rhythm of her steps. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept returning to the piano. The sound of the keys played in her memory, clear and alive. She wondered what it would feel like to sit there again, even for just a moment. The event moved toward its peak. The main program was finished, and guests relaxed into their seats. The music playing through the speakers softened, leaving space for conversation. The room felt expectant, like it was waiting for something without knowing what. The waitress stood near the edge of the hall, holding a tray and watching the crowd. She knew she would soon be asked to do something she had not planned for. She did not know how or when, but she could feel it. Deep inside, a quiet decision was beginning to form. She did not name it. She did not fully accept it yet. But it was there, growing stronger with every passing minute. The piano waited in silence, and so did she. The night continued to move forward, slow but heavy. The laughter that once filled the hall now sounded louder and sharper, as if the walls were pushing it back. The waitress kept working, moving between tables, clearing plates, refilling glasses, and offering polite smiles when needed. On the outside, she looked calm and focused. On the inside, her thoughts would not settle. Every few steps, her eyes drifted toward the piano. It sat quietly, shining under the soft lights, untouched and waiting. The memory of the joke still echoed in her ears. It was not the words that hurt the most, but the way they were spoken, like she was part of the furniture, not a person with a past. She had learned to swallow moments like that. Working around wealthy people required thick skin. Comments were made, jokes were shared, and lines were crossed without much thought. Usually, she let it go. Tonight felt different. As she collected empty glasses from a nearby table, she noticed a few guests watching her more closely than before. Some whispered to each other, glancing between her and the piano. The joke had planted a seed of curiosity. They were waiting to see if anything else would happen. She lowered her gaze and focused on her task. She reminded herself that attention was not always a good thing. Attention could turn into pressure, and pressure could lead to mistakes. She had made it this far by staying invisible. At the service station near the back of the hall, she set down her tray and took a slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly. She pressed them together, steadying herself. She did not understand why her body was reacting this way. She had faced far worse in life than a careless joke. She thought about the long road that had brought her here. Years of working late nights, missing family gatherings, and choosing practicality over passion. Music had once been her safe place, the one thing that made sense when everything else felt uncertain. Letting go of it had been necessary, but it had never stopped hurting. The sound system in the hall went quiet for a moment, signaling a break in the program. Conversations grew louder as guests leaned back in their chairs. A few stood up and stretched, drinks in hand. The piano now stood in complete silence, more noticeable than before. Someone from the earlier table spoke again, louder this time. He mentioned how the evening could use some live music. His tone was playful, but his eyes searched the room. Another guest laughed and repeated the earlier joke, this time more clearly. Several heads turned toward the waitress. She felt it instantly, like a wave pressing against her chest. This time, she could not pretend she had not heard. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. She stood still, holding a stack of plates, unsure what to do next. Her manager noticed the attention and stepped closer, giving her a questioning look. It was not an order, but it was not support either. In places like this, staff were expected to keep guests entertained, even when it crossed into discomfort. She swallowed hard and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the situation. Her heart beat faster. She knew she had a choice, but neither option felt easy. She could refuse and risk looking uncooperative, or she could agree and face something far more personal. She set the plates down carefully and wiped her hands on a cloth. Her thoughts raced. What if she made a mistake? What if she froze? What if the piano felt unfamiliar under her fingers after all this time? Then another thought followed, quieter but stronger. What if she did not? She looked toward the piano again. For a brief moment, the noise of the room faded. All she could see were the keys, black and white, waiting. The memory of sitting alone at the old community piano came rushing back. She remembered how the world used to disappear when she played. She took a step forward before she could talk herself out of it. The movement caught the attention of nearby guests. Whispers spread. Some smiled, expecting entertainment. Others looked curious, unsure of what was about to happen. No one expected anything serious. Her manager watched her closely but said nothing. There was no encouragement, no warning, just silence. She walked slowly across the hall. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sound of her shoes against the floor echoed in her ears. She could feel dozens of eyes following her, measuring her, judging her before she had even done anything. When she reached the piano, she paused. Up close, it looked even more beautiful. The surface reflected the lights above, and the bench was perfectly placed, untouched. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the edge. She sat down carefully. The bench felt unfamiliar but steady. She placed her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. The room was not completely quiet yet, but the noise had softened, replaced by anticipation. She lifted the piano cover slowly. The small sound it made seemed loud in the stillness. Her fingers hovered above the keys, not touching them yet. She closed her eyes for a moment. In that moment, she was no longer in the grand hall. She was back in the community center, alone with an old piano and a room full of dreams. There was no crowd, no judgment, no pressure. Just music. She placed her fingers on the keys. The first note had not yet been played, but the room had already changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were set down. The rich crowd leaned forward slightly, unsure of what to expect. She opened her eyes, looking down at the keys. Her hands were steady now. The fear had not disappeared, but it had moved aside, making room for something else. She was ready. The silence grew deeper, stretching across the hall. Even the staff had paused, watching from a distance. The piano, the crowd, and the waitress were locked in a moment that felt suspended in time. Then, with a calm breath and a quiet resolve, she prepared to play. The first note filled the room softly, almost gently. It was not loud or dramatic. It was calm, steady, and clear. A few guests tilted their heads, surprised by how confident it sounded. The waitress sat straight at the piano, her fingers moving slowly, as if she was testing the space, letting the sound settle before continuing. The second note followed, then another. Soon, a simple melody began to form. It was familiar in feeling, though not everyone could place it. The sound moved through the hall like a quiet wave, touching each table, each guest, without asking permission. At first, some people smiled in amusement. They expected a short tune, something basic, something they could clap politely at and forget. But as the melody grew, their smiles faded into stillness. The music was not rushed, carried patience, control, and emotion. The waitress's hands moved with ease now. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Years of silence fell away as muscle memory took over. Each key responded to her touch, and she responded back, like they had never been apart. A few guests leaned back in their chairs, no longer whispering. Others leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes fixed on the piano. Conversations around the hall faded one by one. Even the soft background noise from the kitchen seemed to disappear. The music deepened. What started as something light slowly became something powerful. There was sadness in it, but also hope. It sounded like a story being told without words. Some guests felt their chests tighten without knowing why. The waitress was no longer thinking about the crowd. She was not thinking about the joke, the laughter, or the pressure. She was thinking about the feeling the music carried. Her face remained calm, but her eyes reflected focus and honesty. As the melody changed, so did the mood of the room. A guest near the front lowered his glass halfway to his lips and forgot to take a sip. Another quietly placed her phone face down on the table, no longer interested in recording or checking messages. The piano seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The high ceiling carried the sound beautifully, allowing it to echo just enough to feel alive. No one spoke. No one laughed. The silence between notes became just as important as the notes themselves. The waitress shifted slightly on the bench, her posture relaxed but strong. Her hands moved faster now, confident and sure. The melody grew more complex, weaving emotions together in a way that felt deeply personal. Some guests exchanged looks, their expressions changing from curiosity to disbelief. They had expected nothing, and now they were being given something they did not know how to process. The idea that someone serving their drinks could create something like this challenged everything they believed. The waitress's breathing stayed steady. She had found her rhythm. The piano was no longer an object in a rich hall. It was her voice. The music reached a softer section, pulling back just enough to make the room lean in. The sound became tender, almost fragile. A few guests felt their eyes sting slightly, though they quickly looked away, unsure why. Memories stirred for some listeners. Others felt emotions they could not name. The music did not belong to one feeling. It held many, layered and honest. The waitress's fingers pressed the keys with intention. Every note mattered. There were no wasted movements, no hesitation. It was clear she was not guessing or improvising carelessly. She knew exactly where she was going. The room felt smaller now, not because of the crowd, but because everyone felt connected to the same moment. Time seemed to slow. No one checked the clock. No one shifted in their seat. As the melody rose again, stronger and fuller, the energy in the hall changed. What once felt like a space for showing off now felt like a space for listening. The rich crowd, so used to being heard, had become silent. The waitress closed her eyes briefly as her hands moved across the keys. The piano responded with warmth and depth. The sound was confident, not perfect, but real. That made it even more powerful. A guest near the back quietly exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. Another rested her chin in her hand, completely absorbed. The music built toward something bigger. The melody climbed, carrying strength and release. The sound filled the hall completely now, leaving no space for doubt. The waitress's shoulders lifted slightly as she reached a peak in the piece. Her fingers moved faster, then slower, guiding the music like a wave. The emotion was clear. This was not a performance meant to impress. It was something deeper. As the final section approached, the room felt heavy with attention. Everyone seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if they could not explain it. The music softened again, slowing, preparing for the end. Each note lingered, hanging in the air before gently fading. The waitress opened her eyes and focused on the keys, fully present. The final note was played with care. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It simply existed, pure and steady, before disappearing into silence. For a moment no one moved. The silence was complete. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that followed something meaningful. The rich crowd sat frozen, stunned by what they had just heard. The waitress lowered her hands slowly and rested them in her lap. Her heart beat fast, but her face remained calm. She did not look up yet. She let the moment settle. The piano stood quiet again, but the room was no longer the same. The silence stayed longer than anyone expected. It stretched across the hall, thick and steady, like the room itself was holding its breath. No one clapped. No one spoke. The sound of the final note seemed to linger in the air, even though it was already gone. The waitress remained seated at the piano, her hands resting in her lap. She did not rush to stand. She did not look around for approval. Her shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath, and only then did she lift her eyes from the keys. What she saw surprised her. Faces that had once looked amused now looked unsure. Some guests stared at the piano as if it had changed shape. Others stared at her, not with laughter, but with something closer to respect. A few looked uncomfortable, as if they had been quietly corrected without a single word being spoken. A glass slipped slightly on a table and made a small sound. It echoed more than it should have, simply because the room was so quiet. Someone cleared their throat. Still, no one clapped. The waitress stood up slowly. The bench made a soft noise as it moved back. She pushed it in gently, the way she always handled things, careful not to draw attention. Her instinct was to step away and return to work, to disappear back into the background where she felt safest. As she took her first step away from the piano, a pair of hands came together. The sound of a single clap cut through the silence. It came from a table near the side of the hall. One guest, older than most of the others, clapped slowly with intention. There was no smile on his face, only focus. Then he clapped again. Another person joined. Then another. The applause grew, not loud or wild, but steady and sincere. Chairs shifted as people sat up straighter. Some guests nodded quietly, as if acknowledging something they had just learned. The waitress stopped walking. She turned slightly, unsure how to respond. Applause was not something she was used to receiving. Her hands hovered awkwardly at her sides. She gave a small nod, nothing more. No bow. No smile meant for the room. Just a quiet acknowledgement. As the clapping continued, she felt a mix of emotions rise inside her. Relief came first. Then pride, quickly followed by disbelief. She had not planned for this. She had only planned to play. When the applause finally faded, the hall felt different. The energy had shifted. Conversations did not immediately return. People spoke more softly now, choosing their words with care. The waitress walked back toward the service area. Her legs felt light, almost unsteady. A few guests watched her pass, their eyes following her in a way that felt new. No one laughed. No one joked. At the service station, another staff member looked at her with wide eyes. There was a brief moment of silence between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then the other worker smiled, a real one, and nodded. She nodded back. Her manager approached a few moments later. His expression was controlled, professional, but different from before. He thanked her quietly and told her to take a short break if she needed one. It was not praise, but it was respect. She stepped into a quiet corner near the back of the hall and leaned against the wall. Her hands shook now that the moment had passed. She pressed them together and breathed deeply, grounding herself. The music still echoed in her mind. She replayed certain parts, wondering if she had rushed a section or held a note too long. Old habits of self-criticism returned, even in the face of applause. From her spot, she watched the crowd. Groups leaned in closer to each other as they talked. The tone had changed. The earlier loud confidence was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful. At the table where the joke had started, the mood was especially quiet. The guests avoided looking in her direction. One stared into his glass, turning it slowly in his hand. Another leaned back, arms crossed, his earlier smile gone. The piano sat untouched again, but it no longer felt like a decoration. Felt like a witness. A woman from a nearby table stood up and approached the service area. She thanked the waitress softly, not as a guest thanking staff, but as one person thanking another. The waitress nodded, unsure what to say. More guests followed with small gestures. Kind word. A look of admiration. Nothing loud. Nothing public. Just moments of quiet acknowledgement. The waitress returned to work when her break ended. She picked up a tray and moved through the hall as she always had. But something inside her had changed. She stood a little straighter. Her steps felt more sure. She noticed that guests spoke to her differently now. Their tone was more careful, more polite. Some even asked her opinion about the music that had played earlier in the evening, as if her voice mattered. She answered briefly and kindly, not wanting to draw the focus back to herself. Attention still made her uncomfortable, but she did not shrink from it anymore. As the event moved closer to its end, the hall slowly returned to motion. Plates were cleared. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Coats were collected. But the earlier energy never fully came back. The waitress passed by the piano one more time while cleaning up. She paused for a second, just long enough to rest her fingers lightly on the closed cover. The surface was cool beneath her touch. She did not open it. She did not play again. The moment had been complete on its own. As guests began to leave, a few turned back to look at the piano, then at her. Their expressions held something thoughtful, almost humbled. The hall slowly emptied, leaving behind the quiet hum of cleanup and the soft echo of footsteps. The waitress gathered her things and prepared to leave for the night. Outside, the air felt cooler and calmer. She stepped into it and took a deep breath. The night sky stretched wide above her, unchanged and steady. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know if this moment would change her life in any obvious way. But she knew one thing for certain. She had not imagined the music. It was real, and so was she. The next morning arrived quietly. The waitress woke before her alarm, the way she often did after a long shift. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of her small room, landing on the wall beside her bed. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the sounds of the city waking up outside. The memory of the night returned slowly, not as noise or pressure but as feeling. The piano, the silence, the way the room had changed. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. For a second, she wondered if it had all been exaggerated by exhaustion. Big nights sometimes felt unreal the next day. But the calm weight in her chest told her it had been real. She went through her usual routine. A simple breakfast. A cup of tea held between both hands. Nothing about the morning looked different, yet everything felt slightly shifted, like furniture moved just an inch to the side. As she got ready for work, her eyes caught a small notebook on the table. It was old, with worn corners and loose pages. She had not opened it in a long time. Inside were pieces of music she had once practiced, notes written in pencil, some faded, some crossed out. She hesitated, then picked it up. The pages smelled faintly of paper and dust. She flipped through them slowly, stopping at a piece she remembered well. Her fingers traced the notes lightly, not playing, just remembering. For years, the notebook had felt like something from another life. Today, it felt closer. The shift that evening felt different from the moment she walked into the hall. The same lights hung from the ceiling. The same tables waited to be set. But the space no longer felt distant. Felt familiar. A few staff members greeted her with quiet smiles. Nothing was said out loud, but the understanding was there. She was still one of them, still working the same job, but she was also something more in their eyes. As guests began to arrive, she noticed small changes. People made eye contact when they spoke to her. Some smiled warmly. Others seemed curious, as if trying to place where they had seen her before. During the early part of the evening, a guest asked if there would be music later. The question was casual, but the tone was different from before. It was not a joke. She answered honestly that she did not know. That was true. The piano remained closed. No spotlight shone on it this time. It stood quietly, like part of the room again. She passed it several times without stopping. As the night progressed, she felt a familiar tension return, but it was softer now. Less fear, more awareness. She knew that eyes might turn toward her again. She also knew she did not owe anyone another moment. During a short break, she stepped outside for air. The city lights flickered in the distance. She leaned against the railing and thought about how close she had come to saying no the night before. She wondered how many times she had said no in her life without realizing it. Not just to others, but to herself. Inside the hall, a small group of guests gathered near the piano. Their conversation was low and respectful. One of them glanced toward her, then looked away, giving her space. Her manager approached and spoke quietly. There had been questions from guests, compliments, even a suggestion that she might play again sometime if she wished. The choice was placed gently in her hands. She thanked him and said she would think about it. And she meant it. She returned to her work, moving through the room with calm focus. She noticed how different it felt to be seen without being judged. The weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. Later in the evening, when the hall was full and the noise had settled into a steady hum, she found herself standing near the piano again. This time, no one had pointed. No one had laughed. She rested her hand on the edge of the instrument, feeling the smooth surface under her palm. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from choice. She looked around the room. Guests were talking quietly. Staff moved smoothly between tables. No one expected anything. She took a breath. She did not open the piano. Instead, she stepped back and returned to her duties. The decision surprised even her. But it felt right. She understood now that the power of the moment came from honesty, not repetition. Near the end of the night, a guest stopped her near the exit. He spoke carefully, choosing his words. He said the music from the night before had stayed with him, that it had reminded him of something he had forgotten. She listened and nodded. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. When the shift ended, she walked home under the quiet sky. Her steps felt steady. The city seemed less heavy. At home, she sat at her small table and opened the notebook again. This time she did not just look. She began to practice. The surface beneath her fingers was not a piano. It was the table. But in her mind the sound was clear. She tapped the rhythm softly, carefully, bringing the music back into her life piece by piece. She did not know where this path would lead. There were no promises waiting at the end of it. But there was truth. And for the first time in a long while that felt like enough. The night came again, heavy with the soft glow of chandeliers and the quiet hum of conversation. The hall was full, but it felt different than before. The guests moved with ease, talking politely, sipping wine, smiling in calm gestures. The atmosphere had a subtle shift, a hint of expectation that was not pressure, but curiosity. The waitress moved through the tables, carrying trays and answering questions, her posture steady, her mind calm. She had practiced these steps countless times, but now, after the nights that had passed, they felt lighter. She no longer felt invisible. She moved through the room with quiet confidence, aware of herself, aware of the space, and aware of the choices she carried inside her. The piano sat at its corner, black and shining. The spotlight caught its surface just right, but no one had pushed it forward or made it the center of attention. It was simply there, waiting, patient. The waitress walked past it a few times, her hands brushing lightly against the smooth surface, a quiet greeting. She did not sit. She did not play. Not yet. Conversations in the hall rose and fell in gentle waves. Guests laughed softly, commented politely, and shared small gestures of appreciation. A few glanced at the piano and then at the waitress, but no one teased, no one laughed, and no one challenged her. The memory of the earlier night lingered in the room, unspoken but felt. Respect had replaced expectation. During a short break, she found herself at the back of the hall. The air smelled faintly of polish and fresh flowers. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, not as pressure, but as a memory she could now own without fear. She thought of the faces that had changed, of the silence that had carried weight, of the music that had moved through the hall like a quiet force. She understood now that her choices mattered more than the applause. The applause had been gratifying, yes, but the respect she felt from herself and the shift in others had been more important. The guests continued to move through the hall, and she returned to her work. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She noticed the subtle changes in how people spoke to her. They were polite but not overly formal, curious but not judgmental. Some even asked about her opinion on the music they had heard, a small but significant acknowledgement. Hours passed in this quiet rhythm. The hall was alive with conversations and activity, but none of it carried the tension of the past. The piano remained closed, a silent companion to the ongoing life of the room. She passed it several times, her eyes flicking to the keys, a memory of music rising softly inside her. At the end of the evening, the room began to empty. Guests thanked the staff, complimented the event, and drifted toward the exits. The applause and laughter of the earlier night had faded into genuine appreciation for the experience, a calm acknowledgement that was less dramatic but more meaningful. The waitress gathered her tray, careful and methodical. She noticed a few guests pausing near the piano, taking in its presence. Their eyes then found her, and in those glances, she sensed something subtle but profound. They recognized her not just as staff, but as someone who had carried something rare within her, who had shared it without needing to prove herself. Her manager approached, his expression neutral but respectful. He did not offer unnecessary praise, only a simple thank you for her work, with a nod that carried weight. She nodded back, feeling the truth of it. As she stepped outside into the quiet night, the city lights stretched wide before her. The cool air brushed against her face, gentle and grounding. She walked slowly, her mind at peace. The world had not changed entirely, but something had shifted, quietly, internally. The night had given her something that was hers alone. Recognition of her own strength, and the knowledge that her choices could shape moments without demanding validation. At home, she opened her notebook. It lay on the table, edges worn, pages filled with faded notes and careful scribbles. She traced her fingers lightly over the lines, feeling the music in her mind. Tonight she would play, not for anyone else, not for applause, but for herself. She would reconnect with the part of her that had been quiet for so long. She set up a small space near the window, where the faint light illuminated the notes. Her fingers hovered over the keys of her small keyboard at home. The first note was soft, tentative, yet full of meaning. She played slowly, deliberately, letting each sound flow naturally. The room was empty, but it felt alive. The music carried a story only she could understand, layered with years of memory, hope, and resilience. Time slipped by unnoticed. The music grew stronger, more fluid. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the movement, the rhythm, the emotion. She remembered the grand hall, the silence, the weight of the night, and she felt it transform within her. What had been a challenge had become a gift, a quiet revelation of her own capabilities. She did not stop when the final note faded. She continued, moving from piece to piece, her hands moving with confidence and care. Each note was a reminder that talent and courage could exist quietly, without spectacle, and still be powerful. The night stretched on, calm and fulfilling. She felt a deep sense of peace, a rare and satisfying feeling that had nothing to do with recognition from others and everything to do with self-acknowledgement. Eventually, she leaned back and let her hands rest. The notes lingered in her mind, soft echoes of a night that had changed everything without shouting. She smiled slightly, not because anyone had praised her, but because she had found her own voice again. Outside, the world remained awake. Cars moved softly in the streets, distant voices drifted through the air, and the city carried on. Inside, she sat quietly, fully present with herself, fully aware of her own strength and resilience. She knew there would be other nights, other events, other challenges. Some would test her. Some would surprise her. But she also knew she would carry this moment with her forever. The night when she chose to play, the night when the room fell silent, the night she reclaimed her own music. And in that knowledge, she found a quiet, unshakable joy. The music was hers, the respect was hers, and the future, whatever it held, was hers to face on her own terms.